Well, David, it's always a wild adventure in the world of live streaming. We're experiencing a little bandwidth difficulty there in the America's neighbor to the north, the great country of Canada. So it's good to have you with me, even though I cannot see you today, David. How are you?
Very good, Jason. It's good to be with you, and I just hope my presence is pervasive enough for you not to see my image.
I'm sure it will be, and it's good that we have these redundant methods that we can use. The show must go on, as they say, and we've got an amazing show prepared for today. As usual, we're going to start here on YouTube and Periscope and DLive and Facebook and all of the different platforms that we're on. It's good for people to maybe, join some of these other platforms, even if it's just the free ones like Periscope. There was a really bizarre outage last Sunday on Charles Ortel's Sunday with Charles, and that was a YouTube outage. People may recall YouTube had sort of like a nationwide outage, and it was extremely difficult for people to watch the show. But Periscope was working, Facebook was working. So if people are watching us on YouTube right now, they can join those other free platforms. But what's really helpful is if people could go to patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards or patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. Those are the channels to use to sponsor this show and others on Crowdsource the Truth. Of course, David's channel is the patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, and it's extremely important that viewers that are watching us right now on patreon.com/crowdsource the truth or subscribestar.com/crowdsource the truth go over to David's Patreon page and sponsor David as well. People can also enjoy David's free website, which is reverse-CSI-scripts.com. David's got our playlists up there, and those contain all of the YouTube videos. It's updated regularly, and that's a good way for people to get up to speed if you've missed last week's show or any of the prior shows. And you can also follow David on Twitter by going to Twitter and searching for @CSI Hawkins. Now, David, you've prepared another really fascinating presentation for us today. You and I have gotten into a relatively new practice of preparing these extensively detailed photo collages that contain the characters that we will discuss in a given show, and they go a long way towards telling a story of their own. Isn't that right?
Yes, I believe these stories, and what I realize now with the playlists that we've done, I think we've done about 72, each one of those, it's basically a dialogue between yourself and myself, and we do this sort of real-time discovery. But I would challenge our listeners, anytime we come up with a theory of what might have happened, just like any science domain or discipline, like geosciences or the oil industry or biology, and a claim of a theory is developed, then if the credibility of the protagonist is reasonable, it's very good for the audience to ground truth, the theory, against empirical evidence. And if we can go straight into this collage, what is extraordinary about the attack on President Kennedy in Dealey Plaza in Dallas was that there were multiple snipers, it would appear. And just a little anecdotal story, I was in Dallas in 1964, and it so happened that I had my hair cut by Jack Ruby's barber, the man who shot, or allegedly shot, Lee Harvey Oswald. And I asked him, at 24, 64, I was 21 at the time, and I asked him, what do the people of Dallas believe happened to President Kennedy? And I still remember that, sends a shiver up my hairs at the back of my neck when I think back on that. He said, everyone in Dallas knows there were multiple shooters, multiple snipers. So fast forward, we have on that post that I sent you this morning a debris pattern, which is suggestive of a bullet from the grassy knoll, which hit President Kennedy just above the right eye, and blew a 6 square inch fragment of his skull out the back of his head. And you got the debris pattern there. Now, you don't have to be a mechanical engineer, a physicist, or whatever to know that if you've got a pattern like that, then the bullet that blew the back of his head off and into the skull fragment into the grass of Dealey Plaza had to have come from the front. So whether or not Lee Harvey Oswald shot from the book depository, and that's a debatable question, this fellow James E. Files claims very credibly, and it's an extraordinary interview when he's in jail, that he had a Remington XP-150 fireball rifle. He'd taken a .222 shell, and he'd filled the head with mercury, which, when it hits a target, of course, creates an enormous hydrostatic pressure, which would very likely blow a fragment of skull off, whereas if it was a pointed munition, it would go straight through the skull and create a hole, an exit hole, that have some resemblance to the entrance hole. Now, I don't know if your listeners know, but the British, I don't say they invented the big game dum-dum bullet, but by the end of the 19th century, the British at a factory called Dum Dum in India had an inventory of 40 million dum-dum bullets. And the idea of a dum-dum bullet, rather cruelly, is if you are being attacked by tribesmen that heavy on drugs and rage and anger, if you shoot them with a pointed bullet, it tends to go straight through them and doesn't stop them. So the British developed this dum-dum bullet and spread it around the world for law and order in certain local communities. Now, whether you like the British or not, what intrigues me is the technology rate of adoption by the British is extraordinarily rapid, and whenever they see a technical advantage, they take advantage of it and use it to develop their empire. Now, in 1870, there was an organization set up in the City of London called the City and Guilds of London Institute. And I believe we have a great deal of evidence that that was set up by the bankers N.M. Rothschild and Sons Limited, which is incidentally the investment banker for President Trump, Queen Elizabeth II, and this British company called SERCO, the famous outsourcer that we've drawn a lot of attention to.
Yeah.
Now, in 1870, something else was done. The Anglo-American Telegraph Company was formed. And eventually, by the end of that century and the beginning of the next, the so-called all-red line had been installed around the world, and I think by the First World War, the England or the United Kingdom had 52 lines running into it, and various other parts, Canada and Australia and New Zealand and Singapore and the Far East, they had multiple connections, while in the First World War, the Germans had about one connection, which the British very quickly intercepted and cut. So now, if you're going to war strategically, not with the world, but using the help of the world, it pays to have an imperial brain, which was the nickname of the instrument room of the General Post Office in London, and an all-red line of multiple connections that allow you to communicate with your friends and isolate your enemies. And almost inevitably, I would say, if you're in that position, you're going to win the war. So I don't say the British won the First World War, or the Second World War, but with their allies, including the United States and Australia and New Zealand and Canada, basically, I think to this day, the Five Eyes countries are the most powerful and dominant signals intelligence entity in the world.
Yeah.
Except that we have a number of traitors, or you have a number of traitors in your midst, who have been selling technology to people who would traditionally be described as the America's enemies. And we're talking about the elite group of teachers in the tunnel, which I think we have now, people who have listened to us know very well, that we've covered off Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dawn, the criminal and leaders of the Weather Underground organization, whose declared objective was to destroy America. And in fact, I think their organization was penetrated by a Larry Grewald, or some name rather similar to that, who asked them what they would do if their revolution was successful, to secure their revolution. And they replied, well, they're going to put a lot of Americans in re-education camps, and they would probably be ready to kill 25 million Americans. Now, with the American system of justice being what it is, these guys, as guilty as hell and free as a bird, I think that was the boast of Bill Ayers. And, well, unfortunately for America, Bernadine Dawn was taken on by this law firm, Sidley Austin, and she groomed, as far as I can see, Barack Hussein Obama and Michelle Obama to continue the revolution and ultimately enable their career to get them into the White House with, of course, the intermediary of Bill and Hillary Clinton.
Now, David, let me pause you for a moment. Let me pause you and ask you this. Well, I just want to ask you this, because I think a lot of people will look at this collage and possibly be slightly confused by it. Of course, we're talking primarily about the JFK assassination, but we want to help our viewers understand how this type of conspiracy is not an isolated thing, and the cover-up didn't take place in 1963 and stop there. Can you explain for everyone watching perhaps why we are including such figures as Joseph Kennedy, Winston Churchill, and Sam Giancana in the same image as Cass Sunstein and Maureen Baginski, Roy Gardner, our good buddy here, what's his name, Wilbur Ross, who, incidentally, with all his billions, he can't afford a nose hair trimmer. That's pretty nasty.
Maybe you should get hold of my barber, Jack Ruby's barber. Yes, absolutely. Because these great crimes, you see, really, I suppose it sounds a little bizarre. The crime itself is obviously important. What's most important from the conspiracy is how do you cover it up over decades? Because lots and lots of people, even today, would like to know what happened to John F. Kennedy, right? And the fact that they don't is an indication of the power of the organization at manipulating history or manipulating people like yourself and myself as we dig into the past and uncover these extraordinary events. Now, if I go back to SERCO at a place called Hawk Hills in the United Kingdom provides a very interesting service, which I think Mr. Zweigart would love, which is fake news and media plays. And what SERCO will do, it will borrow the communication systems of the United Kingdom government and the Five Eyes allies and inject fake news or media plays, if you will, and then provide professional television journalists actually to interview public servants and make sure that the public is not panicked. My argument is actually the panic, not necessarily that the public is not panicked. What I think is most important is the public is alerted and educated to the scale of this conspiracy.
Yeah.
Right? So the fact that Sam Giancana had a motive to have Kennedy rubbed out is interesting, and obviously Sam Giancana was eventually assassinated in his own right. But even all of these people, no matter how powerful they are, Jason, are expendable. The basic organization, the Matrix, which I believe is a patent-for-rent, murder-for-hire network that can put on a high-value target or a mass casualty event at any time, its power flows from the fact that it can crush investigators. It can distort and decoy investigators, right? So the fact that Joseph Kennedy was basically a good friend of Churchill's and arranged some very interesting investments for Churchill to make, I believe, in the Brooklyn Tunnel. Did you know that Churchill was invested in the Brooklyn Tunnel, which I find quite interesting?
Brooklyn Battery Tunnel?
Yes. Right, on the advice of Joseph Kennedy.
Well, how could he invest in that? The Brooklyn Battery Tunnel is the property of the what is that? The Port Authority.
Yeah, but I think they floated some bonds or something. So
wow.
Anyway, Joseph Kennedy, I believe, recommended to Churchill. But more important, I believe Churchill invested in some of the distillers' operations. The Scotch whiskey, because after Prohibition, Joseph Kennedy was able to gain from the British government and the distillers the exclusive rights to import Scotch whiskey and made a fortune, right? And he did it, and by then Sam Giancana, he's the rather suspicious-looking guy with the dark glasses and the funny hat, right? This guy By 1950, and shortly afterwards, he had taken total control of the bookmakers of Chicago. Now, it was one very important bookmaker for the purposes of the Kennedy assassination, or at least our theory of the Kennedy assassination, which is that he was hit by a sports book sniper, and I'll come back to that.
Yeah.
One very important individual in respect of the possibility of having a global network of sports book killers is the fact that the inventor of the sports book was a man by the name of Charles McNeill. And Charles McNeill was JFK's mathematics teacher at his grade school.
Well, but David, isn't it true that he invented spot fixing? Did he invent the sports book or spread betting?
Yeah, no, he invented the spread, the point spread betting system, right? Where the bookmaker opens a book, right, called a sports book, on not the actual result between between University Club A and University Club B, i.e. that A beats B and there's a certain odds on that. What they're betting on is the spread in the scores, right? So if it's 110 in a basketball game to 90, that would be a spread, and you can bet above and below the spread. If the point spread is greater, then the people who bet above, they win. If it's less than that, they win. But the spread is very interesting because the sports book then contains a balance. I mean, that's what the goal of the bookmaker is, to have an equal number of dollars on the above the spread and the below the spread, right? And take 15%. It's known as a vigorish. Basically, it's a commission.
Right.
And the research that we're finding or doing is that now a British company, Americans should be amazed at this, a British company called William Hill, probably the largest bookmaker in the world, invented or introduced virtual reality sportsbook betting and entered the Nevada Gaming Commission, and I believe it's extorted itself into a position where it now controls 66% of the Nevada sportsbook operations.
Yeah.
And, of course, it's just pushing aside competitors. One of those competitors, I understand, was MGM. So if you look back at that MGM Mandalay Bay shooting, the people at the Harvest Festival, it looks very much like a racketeering operation to shake down MGM and basically tell them to get the hell out of sportsbook operations. We're coming in.
Right.
Now, William Hill, and you talk about, why have we put these different kind of characters up above the parapet of that bridge across Dealey Plaza, the road tunnel. If you slide it over to the right, we've got this character skulking behind Wilbur Ross and Maureen Baginski, who was 25 years with the National Security Agency, and his name is Roy Gardner. Mm-hmm. And Roy Gardner is a fellow of the City and Guilds Institute of London. He's a director of William Hill. He's a director of Willis Holdings, and Willis Holdings is the insurance company that insured the Titanic and put together the policy for the Twin Towers.
Yeah.
Such that when both towers came down in the same day, this is quite incredible. This is a fraud on a scale I believe most people just wouldn't have difficulty in getting their heads around, and I guess that's our job to basically simplify this to the point where people can grasp the enormity of the crime. As far as I can see, Roy Gardner would have been in a position as chairman of SERCO, right, to structure the insurance policy on the Twin Towers such that if they both came down on the same day, a double occurrence claim could be filed in the Southern District Court of New York, and Judge Silverstein, it's Larry Silverstein, Hellenstein, I think is the judge, and basically they didn't double their money, which would have given them a $3.2 billion profit, because the 99-year mortgage from the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey on the Twin Towers was $3.2 billion. And if, of course, both came down on the same day, they could claim 6.4. Well, I think most of the insurance and the reinsurance companies realized this was a scam, and they reduced the profit to $1.2 billion. But for a 6-week adjustment to the insurance policy note, that's not bad money, is it?
Not bad at all. David, may I draw your attention to something else? Because you always, it's funny, you and I have now been speaking extensively about this topic all week, but you always bring up things on the fly during the show that I've never heard before that are quite interesting. You mentioned the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, which has pretty recently been renamed the Hugh L. Carey Tunnel. I don't know who Hugh L. Carey is, but do you know where the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, the Manhattan entrance is, David?
Is it anywhere near the Winter Gardens?
It's right next to it. As a matter of fact, you can see the
gosh.
World Trade Center from the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel entrance. I'm just zooming out here so that everybody can see it. It's a little difficult to navigate Google Earth, but there is the World Trade Center as we zoom out.
Well, let me just
what's
touch
the
on that.
significance of that? Yeah.
Now, the all red line connected the colonies, if you will, by 1901. So running into the First World War, the British had multiple redundancy for the telegraph cable around the world. The Germans had almost zero redundancy and lost contact, I mean, with a number of its allies, I believe, in South America very quickly. And of course, that's a huge advantage for the Brits working with the Americans, Canada, Australia and New Zealand in times of war, the First World War, and in the Second World War. Now, Marconi invented and demonstrated the wireless telegraph in 1899 at a place called Toynbee Hall in London's East End, where Toynbee Hall is right at the center of the canonical murders attributed to Jack the Ripper, who signed his letter allegedly in blood, in red, and the media, of course, jumped on. This was a classic media play through, I would suggest, the Worshipful Company of newspaper makers and stationers. So that was injected, and then everyone started hunting for Jack the Ripper. And as far as I know, they're still looking, although we have suggested that it wasn't Jack the Ripper, it was Jane the Ripper, who won the 1931 Nobel Peace Prize. And Jane the Ripper was a radical left-wing philanthropist, if you will. She happened to be a lesbian. That's just the way it is. Her girlfriend's name was Ellen Starr. And Ellen Starr and Jane Addams were staying at Toynbee Hall in September of 1888,
Right.
when the first murder of a prostitute took place. And subsequently, I've been trying to find out their travel schedule. It said they went back to America, but I think they were actually out on the streets prowling around, dressed as men, and killing women. But I digress. My point is about the cover-up. Just think, those extraordinary high-profile media play-type murders associated with Jack the Ripper, people are still fascinated and still distracted and still looking in the wrong direction. The murder of President Kennedy, from a ballistic point of view, if you go back to that picture that we have of the debris pile, or the debris, the evidence, that is empirical evidence that is not disputed, as far as I know. And if it is, well, maybe some of our listeners could get back to us. But the grassy knoll, it's ahead of JFK as he's coming in the car. A shot takes place. I mean, this is what James E. Farr says he did. He stood, he shot Kennedy, he took the casing shell, bit on it, and put it upright on the parapet of the grassy knoll, and then subsequently they say he liked the taste of gunpowder. Now, that's a bit unreal. Now, you told me that you found something very odd, or you think there's something odd about the James Farr confessions. Do you remember what you said to me?
Yeah, I actually was aware of that James Files confession. I think I've said many times to people who watch Crowdsource the Truth that part of the way that I became involved in this was I had a knee injury that put me in a rehab program for a while where I was on an elliptical bike for 60 to 90 minutes a day, and I was watching a lot of documentaries about the JFK assassination, came across this James Files confession. And I think, David, there are still quite a few people who are unaware of James Files, but he was in prison at the time, I believe, for murdering a judge or some other charge. He was never arrested for this, but he was in prison at the time of the interview with Jim Marrs. And Jim Marrs was one of the most famous and prolific writers on the subject of the JFK assassination. So James Files gives them an interview on VHS or something where he's explaining in extensive detail how he traveled, where he met people at, Waffle House and stuff like that, how he sat there, how he used a Remington XP, is it 100 or X150?
XP 150.
150 Fireball. Yeah, it was a handheld rifle, basically the most accurate handgun in the world, and it was given to him, according to him, by David Atlee Phillips, who was a CIA operative. In 1963, the gun was not available to the public to purchase, but it subsequently was released by Remington, and he claims that a criminal gunsmith, a mafiosa gunsmith, took a regular, I'm not enough of a gun guy to remember, it was a 223, a 222, whatever round goes in this gun.
222.
And I've seen that since then. I went to a gun shop in Texas and asked him to show me. It's a tiny little thing, David. It caused me to question if James Files' statement could be true, if a 222 round could in fact be drilled to put liquid mercury in the tip of it and to create the hydrostatic shock that you're talking about. It's hard to find a picture of somebody holding one of these to give you the impression of exactly how small it is, but I found it very small. And so I have not, and I've asked any gunsmith I've ever spoken to if it could be done, and it's like asking a doctor how long you're going to live or asking a lawyer if you're going to win a lawsuit, because they never give you a direct answer. I have not been able to get an actual gunsmith to tell me, yes, I've made a round like that, and yes, I've successfully fired it. Because even though I don't know that much about guns, David, it strikes me that changing the aerodynamics and the mechanical structure of a bullet, in my view, would seem to have a huge impact on the flight of that bullet. So the notion that you could insert liquid mercury into this tiny little bullet, seal it up with wax, put it in a gun, fire it from the gun, have the liquid mercury wax combination survive the firing process and reach the target to create this hydrostatic shock wave, that in and of itself, I had no knowledge to verify, but seemed like quite a feat. The other thing that struck me as super odd is, why would a guy in prison admit to a murder of essentially, he's basically admitting to the most famous murder in history, and there's no statute of limitations on murder, so what's this guy's upside? Why would he tell the world that he did this when, if it were true and verified, he would spend the rest of his life in jail?
Well, this is extraordinary, because this, I think, is the opportunity for us to reveal a technique which the British are expert in, is laying a false flag or injecting a media play. Now, there's a famous British film called The Man Who Never Was, and I think actually James E. File is the man who never was. That is, I believe, through a corrupt...
Let me interrupt you, David, because what I think we should do is, we obviously want to cover this in great detail, but we don't want to jam everything into our preview show here, because we have a lot to discuss, and some of these details about what you've discovered relative to James Files' confession are super important, and we're going to need some more time to discuss them. So I want to take this time to remind everyone that in just about 30 minutes from right now at 1 p.m. Eastern, we're going to be continuing the show on our sponsor-only platform. So people should be going over to patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, or subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and we'll be having a much more detailed discussion over there. We have about 10 or 15 minutes more here, but why don't we put a pin in the James Files portion of the story and talk about some of the other things that we're going to cover when we do carry on patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth.
Okay, yes, thank you, Jason. So let's just go back generically to the British construction, creation, development of the world's greatest empire, at least if you recognize an empire as a trading empire. There were times in the end of the 19th century where there would be 20,000 ships in the port of London from all over the world, right? We had an extraordinarily sophisticated operation where, for example, would one day give birth to these modern city and guilds livery companies, including the Worshipful Company of World Traders. Well, it's very simple. With an organization in the City of London called the Worshipful Company of World Traders, when that company gets letters patent from the Crown to practice its art, well, one of the implied statements or authorities of the Crown is you can go and demonstrate and dominate world trade anywhere in the world. Now, fast forward to 9/11, of course, you have the iconic World Trade Center buildings, right? And from the point of view of the Worshipful Company of World Traders in the City of London, I would say this was red rag to a bull, right? There was a lot of very intelligent and capable people inside the World Trade Center in the areas of banking and insurance and broking. And of course, by killing them all, or at least everyone above the point of impact, that would reinforce the role of the British, or the City of London, world traders, as the center of world trade. And I have to say, unfortunately, by the time the dust settled in New York, the center of world trade went back to London.
Yeah.
And a number of companies paid very heavily for the neglect by the American intelligence agencies to recognize the origin of the attack on President Kennedy in 1963 was not one lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, and it sure as hell wasn't James E. Files, a second possible gunman. It was a global organization associated with what I think we will be able to prove is a patent for rent, murder for hire network that uses extremely sophisticated techniques to reward the agents or the SWAT teams without provoking the attention of British intelligence or American intelligence. And so I'm coming now to this extraordinary process of carbon credits. And maybe people don't understand this idea of a carbon credit. You can actually get a carbon credit by shutting down a factory that's belching out carbon dioxide. Interestingly enough, you can also get carbon credits for knocking a Boeing 737 MAX 8 out of the skies. Because
who's giving those carbon credits,
what?
David? Who is giving
Sorry?
those when, let's say someone does actively take an airplane out, who's giving them carbon credits for that?
I think it's the bookmaker that is sitting between big investment entities, right? People who are investing in the weight of carbon saved above the spread, and people who are investing in the weight of carbon below the spread. And what the bookmaker does, if it's able to bring down that spread, then it gets a 15% vig or vigorish from the investors that is translated into carbon credits. So it issues carbon credits to the people who knock the plane out of the skies, right? And the people who knock the plane out of the skies, I believe, are agents for the city and guilds. So, for example, one of the guilds is the Honorable Company of Air Pilots and Air Navigators. And the Honorable Company of Air Pilots and Air Navigators had as Grand Master on 911 Prince Philip. And his son, Prince Andrew, was, I think, flying to Atlanta. Now, am I saying that Prince Philip or Prince Andrew were knowingly engaged in the attack of 911? No, I think they're a component in a very complex and very elegant structure, if you will, where different trades and different professions organized into guilds put on what in the 12th, 13th, and 14th and 15th century would be called a mystery, miracle, or morality play. And that is to say, on a cart that would be towed by horses, presumably into a village or a town, actors would perform their lines, and this was the precursor to the Reformation and the Shakespeare theatre. But crowds would be massed. Sometimes it would be a 4-day holiday, and they would go through a cycle of events where, for example, Jesus would be ultimately nailed to the cross, or from the birth of Jesus right through to the wise men visiting, and ultimately, the sacrifice on the cross. So the public was very early on manipulated into believing these mystery plays and the actors. And what I'm saying is, I think if we go back to the role played by SERCO in the United Kingdom of media plays, I think the modern media play by SERCO in command of an extraordinary communications network that includes fiber optics is a rerun of the mystery, morality, and magical plays of the medieval era. So if you
David,
go
is
back,
there a connection between those things and a passion play? I've heard about passion plays are usually about the crucifixion of Christ, aren't they?
Yes. I mean, they're different names, but the important thing is it's a fascinating play between perception, illusion, and reality. And for those people who studied philosophy and Plato's cave, there's that great story put presumably by Plato about how do you differentiate between reality and illusion. If you've been chained inside a cave and you're looking at the back wall and there are figures passing in front of the cave backlit by the sunlight, so the person in the cave gets to see two-dimensional figures strutting around on the back cave like a screen. So what you've got there on the picture is this is the evil bat cave at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and obviously I presume some very well-meaning people are proudly standing in front of these extraordinary screens which can put on images of reality or simulation. So you could actually now have a sportsbook presentation of a game, a football game, where people could bet, and the evil bat cave at the University of Illinois, Chicago is hooked through fiber optic links. And incidentally, fiber optics was invented by STC, Standard Telephone and Cables, which spun off from ITT in, I believe, the 1920s, and ultimately did this amazing program of inventions, including pulse code modulation and fiber optics. STC was, I believe, run by Roy Gardner. He took it through a buyout by Nortel in 1991. Nortel became the world's largest provider of fiber optic links, and I believe Nortel and its subsidiary or spin-off called Entrust basically installed public key infrastructure with high density or high bandwidth fiber optic links around the world on that extraordinary network created with Northwestern University IT partnerships. Now, Northwestern University, in its wisdom, employed a psychopath by the name of Bernardine Dawn, who gave seminars on torture, paradigms, and practice. So I think both you and I would like to challenge Americans generally and say, what the hell are you doing here?
Yeah.
You've actually taken on Bill Ayers, who's an unindicted killer and a psychopath, at the University of Illinois, Chicago, which hosts the Electronic Visualization Laboratory, and you've taken Bernardine Dawn on faculty at the University, Northwestern University. The two of them, as far as I could see, would be superbly positioned with motive, opportunity, and weapon to scare the hell out of the university board of trustees, etc., and get them to embrace and endorse and implement a global patent for rent, murder for hire network, where literally you could set up a sports betting capability inside the Electronic Visualization Laboratory on 911 to place bets by elite teachers on the attacks in New York, where they might be betting on the number of dead firefighters. And let's say how might that work? Well, you have SERCO meeting with its shareholders on the 47th floor of the North Tower. I believe they had set up a sports book. And the institutions betting on either side of the spread would include the British government, the Saudi Arabian government, the Singaporean government, the two big teachers' pension funds, University Superannuation Scheme from the United Kingdom, which has, I think, £50 billion of assets under management, and it's the biggest pension fund in the United Kingdom, and TIAA, Teachers Insurance Annuity Association, which is the biggest private pension fund in the world at over $1 trillion assets under management, $1 trillion of assets under management. You put the two together, very coincidental, I guess. The teacher's pension fund equals the student debt. So, being a simple man, I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if we consolidated student debt with teachers' pension, and that would remove some of the moral hazard of teaching the students the nonsense of catastrophic anthropogenic global warming, which inevitably leaves them with fewer job opportunities to pay off their debt. Over to you.
Yes, and you know, David, I apologize. I was in a bit of a rush and I haven't had an opportunity to stack the debt quite as high on our friend, the student here, but you know, you said that it was coincidental that the TIAA pension fund had almost the identical amount that students have in debt. The other thing that's actually quite remarkably coincidental, when we go back to this image of the evil bat cave at the University of Chicago, Illinois, it looks remarkably similar to a sports book that you would see in a casino. And again, we're not saying that this is the sole purpose. We are aware that a lot of research and visualization is happening in this laboratory, but it's my understanding, David, that you're pointing out the technologies that would enable these things to happen, and people cannot deny the coincidence of Bernardine Dohrn, Bill Ayers being involved with these organizations, these universities, their dedication to destroying the United States of America, the targets that the Weather Underground selected, of course, police headquarters, banks, the Capitol building, the Pentagon, and what did we see hit on 9/11? The Pentagon, the World Trade Center, obviously full of banks and police. And, you know, I share your opinion, David, that there is not a coincidence going on here. We're almost out of time with our preview show right now, so it's going to be very important for people to make their way over to patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards and patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth or subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. We're going to be going into a lot more details about how David has formulated this theory, which I agree with, David, that there really is no way that James Files did what he said he did. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to think that a guy that would commit murder could also be a liar. I think that we're going to get into some details about some of the things that James Files spoke about and how you have discovered that these sort of obviate the possibility of him being the murderer. And I must admit, David, I feel some sense of satisfaction after you've come to this conclusion that I've always, as much as I wanted to have this confirmation that the eyewitnesses who saw smoke and two men behind the picket fence in the grassy knoll after they saw a flash and heard a loud bang, people who don't believe the official story want some confirmation. It's like these 5 dancing Israelis that are associated with 9/11. There are many, many people who want to say Israel did 9/11. And of course, these 5 Israeli guys were arrested, but who put them there? Wouldn't it be just as logical for someone other than the country of Israel who might want you to think that Israel did it to put them there, or for someone who wanted you to think that James Files did this, to have him confess to it? I think people really need to think about the concept of social engineering and how there are people out there who are constantly trying to trick us, and unraveling that trick can be quite challenging.
Yeah, and absolutely right. And I think actually there was someone on the knoll with a XP-150 Remington rifle, with a mercury-filled round, right? It just wasn't James E. Files. So going back to that film, which is essentially a British deception maneuver in World War II, I think James E. Files is the man who never was. I mean, that is to say, he is a man, and he was heavily involved in organized crime, but he wasn't the guy on the knoll, and they set up fake evidence, which is this casing and the bitumen, in order to have him, to a certain degree of credibility, distract a whole bunch of people into thinking it was him, and then ultimately releasing him with the statement that if he ever revealed...
Let's not give away the whole shebang that we're going to be talking about, because
it's
we're
so
just
exciting.
Less than 15 minutes from now, we'll be on patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. David, I'll see you there, and thanks everybody for watching.
Thank you, Jason.